Brexit derangement syndrome is still alive and well. According to elite Remainers, everything bad that happens in Britain can be boiled down to one simple cause: our vote to leave the EU in 2016. From sluggish economic growth to shortages of sandwiches, from the rising cost of living to the lies told by politicians, anything and everything can apparently be blamed on Brexit. For years, we've been fed a fact-free diet of doom that's mostly gone unchallenged by our pliant Remainstream media. So, with that in mind, here are some of the 4 biggest Remoaner myths about Brexit. Myth number 1. Brexit has been bad for the economy. Remember Project Fear? Back in 2016, Remain campaigners warned of an economic apocalypse in the aftermath of the referendum.
A British exit from the European Union would be a serious risk to growth, according to the leaders of the G7 nations.
Vote to depart the EU would be costly in the long run.
Socially and economically absolutely disastrous.
This could be, for the first time in history, a recession brought on ourselves.
Across Britain, as many as 820,000 jobs could be lost.
Voting leave was going to trigger an immediate deep recession, we were told. Unemployment would then spiral, financial markets would collapse, and wages would be slashed. None of that happened. But cynical Remainers have proceeded to blame all of our economic woes on Brexit regardless. Since 2020, when Brexit officially got done, it's true that Britain has been battered by some huge economic headwinds. There was the pandemic and the months-long lockdowns. The recession was deep and painful. Then came the war in Ukraine. The global energy crisis that followed pushed inflation into the stratosphere. None of this had anything to do with Brexit, of course, but pro-EU commentators still insist that Brexit has made these crises much worse than they otherwise would have been.
Our economy is tanking.
The other countries seem to have recovered a lot better from it than we have.
Now that myth has been firmly put to bed by the data. Thanks to recent revisions in the UK's GDP figures, we now know that Brexit Britain had one of the strongest economic recoveries from the pandemic in the G7. It's performed about as well as France and has grown at a far faster pace than Germany. Inflation in Britain is bad, yes, but it's not been any worse than in the Eurozone. And since we left the EU, despite the dire warnings about closed factories and job losses, the value of our manufacturing sector has grown enormously. In 2022, British exports to the EU reached their highest levels since records began. Now, Brexit was never an economic silver bullet. It all comes down to what policies we pursue now with our newly restored freedoms. But the idea that Brexit has turned us into an economic basket case is just not true. The economic case against Brexit is built on sand. Myth number 2. Brexit was driven by lies.
Never heard so much crap in all my life.
Remainer pundits can barely go 5 minutes without bringing up the infamous Vote Leave campaign bus, which declared that leaving the EU would save Britain £350 million per week, which could be spent on the NHS instead.
We think that money would be better directed
a week
by
figure, which you have emblazoned on the side of the bus.
£350 million per week.
Brits, do you remember making this pledge that £350 million would go to the NHS?
The £350 million, we're still waiting on that.
This is brought up to suggest that the Leave vote was built on lies and disinformation, making it basically null and void. But this has always been desperate nonsense. First of all, the £350 million claim isn't so much a flagrant lie as it is a classic bit of spin. It's the sort the anti-Brexit Blairite apparatchiks pioneered back in their day. You see, the £350 million referred to was the UK's gross contribution to the EU, and so it ignored what we used to get back in rebates and in EU funding. The net figure remained a whopping £199 million per week, so the bus may have been a bit misleading, yes, but it was hardly the most outrageous political claim in recent memory, or even during the referendum campaign. I mean, what about the porkies told by the Remain side? Then Chancellor George Osborne said we'd each be £4,000 worse off if we voted to leave. He said there'd have to be an emergency budget with cuts to pensions and public services. These claims were far more outlandish than anything uttered by the Leavers. Besides, polling suggests that voters didn't look to either the Remain campaign or the Leave campaign for their information. An Electoral Reform Society report found that people were much more likely to look to their family for trusted information than to the Vote Leave campaign. Leave voters were not gullible idiots, hoodwinked by a catchy slogan on the side of a bus. We made up our own minds about Brexit, and we came to exactly the right decision. Myth number 3. Brexit has killed people. Now we come to the most morbid Brexit myth. Ever since COVID struck the UK, Remainers have tried to tie the death toll to Brexit. Leaving the EU, they say, turned us into Plague Island, a post-apocalyptic wasteland of death and disease. Even the official COVID inquiry has kept banging on about Brexit. On its very first day, the Chief Counsel, Hugo Keith KC, insisted that Brexit had hindered preparations for the 2020 pandemic.
It is clear that such planning from 2018 onwards crowded out and prevented some, or perhaps a majority of the improvements that central government itself understood were required to be made to resilience planning and preparedness.
This is simply untrue. In fact, Brexit was probably more a help than a hindrance. The government's planning for a no-deal Brexit actually helped our civil servants source medical supplies, which might have come in handy for the global health emergency. And then there were the vaccines.
But in the UK, the prospect of Brexit border delays in the new year pose a genuine threat to the smooth delivery of up to 40 million doses.
We were told we needed to be in the EU's vaccine scheme. Striking out on our own would mean sacrificing British lives at the altar of Brexit, politicians cried. But in the end, it was the EU that faltered.
Yet if supply is tight in the UK, it's even tighter in Europe.
The rollout has been complicated and uneven.
The EU has threatened to impose export controls on vaccinations made in the bloc.
The bureaucrats in Brussels struggled to secure enough doses to inoculate the continent. Meanwhile, Brexit Britain, free from the EU's grip, was able to race ahead. By mid-January in 2021, the UK had given out twice as many jabs per person as Denmark, the fastest EU member at the time. By March, the UK had vaccinated 40% of its population, while the EU had managed a measly 12%. What's more, looking back on the pandemic, Britain was hardly the worst afflicted country. Although much of the media won't have told you this, we actually had fewer excess deaths than Spain, Italy and Germany. The Remainer talk of Plague Island was never based on facts. This was a ghoulish attempt to tie the worst health crisis in decades to our democratic decision to leave the EU. It was a shameful, cynical ploy, and it should be called out as such. Myth number 4. Brexit was all about racism.
The effort that went into persuading you that there were too many foreigners in this country was absolutely intrinsic to the success of Brexit.
This might be the most enduring and pernicious myth of them all. We've been told time and again that Leave voters were driven by racism and xenophobia, and that Britain is a far more intolerant, inward-looking country today than it was before 2016.
After the Brexit vote and the decision for the UK to leave the EU, there have been a number of racist incidents reported.
Xenophobic insults and abuse have become commonplace.
The country's more divided than ever.
The vote Leave was largely an anti-immigration vote, and parts of the Leave campaign seemed to give racism and xenophobia legitimacy, and racist incidents have skyrocketed.
Nothing could be further from the truth. First of all, Brexit, above all, was about control. The number one reason people voted to leave, according to the post-referendum Ashcroft polls, was the principle that laws that govern this country should be made in this country. Second, while immigration was also a very high priority, this isn't because Leave voters are racist and xenophobic. What Britons wanted from Brexit was not to pull up the drawbridge or to kick out all the foreigners. They wanted control over immigration, a managed regime at the border, rather than free movement with the EU. As it happens, around a third of ethnic minority Brits voted for Brexit, because many of them thought the EU immigration system was unjust, allowing mostly white Europeans to arrive at will, while migrants from the rest of the world were kept out by Fortress Europe. Tellingly, since the EU referendum, voters' concern about immigration has plummeted. The proportion who say migration must fall has dropped from 65% in 2015 to 42% in 2022. This is happening even as the post-Brexit rules have allowed more people from Africa and Asia to come in. Yes, people are worried about the small boats crisis. Yes, people are concerned that immigration is high. But this is not about racism, and it never has been. Survey after survey shows that Britain is one of the most welcoming places on earth. A global survey from King's College London this year found that just 2% of Brits would be uncomfortable having a neighbour of another race, a far lower score than every European country bar Sweden. Blaming Brexit on racism is a smear against the British people, and it cannot be allowed to stand. All of these myths make one thing abundantly clear. It's elite Remainers who are the most economical with the truth. For all the talk about the Brexiteers being liars, for all the complaints about our age of post-truth politics, it's the pro-EU elites who have lost touch with reality. They're willing to spread any old nonsense, if doing so might help their campaign to overturn the biggest democratic mandate in our history. Leave voters were absolutely right to give these people a bloody nose.